Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. We are so excited to have Doug Laney joining us today for the latest in our series of seminars, How CDOs Succeed. And if you're tuning in for this one, I hope that you'll also tune in again at the beginning of next month when Doug will come back and give us one that I'm excited about this one, but I'm even more excited about his next one where he talks about a business case for the Chief Data Officer. Let me just spend a minute introducing Doug and thanking him for joining us today. Doug has been known to the community here for many, many decades. I don't mean to put you as too old, Doug, but you definitely have been around and contributed a lot. And if you aren't aware, his seminal book, Infonomics, has been quoted and noted in many, many places around the world as the real definitive approach on how to think about monetizing, managing, and measuring information in this. CIO magazine called it the must-read book of the year around that. And Doug, you're right in the throes of another book, I think. I talked to Kevin Garrison yesterday, and he said he was working on one of yours. So we're so happy to have you here. Doug has spent a lot of years with Gartner and doing analyst work. One of the reasons he's able to give us this very good bird's eye view of the whole system has participated with us in the MIT CDO events on an annual basis on this, and he also guest lectures as well as teaches specific courses on Infonomics at the University of Illinois. Is that G's College of Business or Guy's College of Business?
G's and Gosling's, yeah.
Goslings, got it.
We call it Goslings, yeah.
Goslings. Well, enough from me. Doug, it's such a pleasure to have you here. I'm going to transfer the control over to you and let you take it away.
All right, thanks, Peter. All right, let's see what we're going to show here. We are going to show the slide. You can confirm I'm showing the right thing here?
We can.
Groovy. All right. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for inviting me. Robert, thanks for your expert handling and orchestration of these things. You are the master. It's great to be with everyone today. As Peter mentioned, a few years ago, I published a book on Infonomics on how to manage and monetize and measure data as an actual corporate asset. And we'll talk about what all that means, the implications, the challenges in doing so. Yeah, so away we go. Oh, I was going to say, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. So if anybody has any questions or anything that you'd like me to address or deep dive into, we'll certainly have time, and I can certainly do it synchronously if you like, or maybe queue up questions for the end. But if you have some questions or comments throughout, feel free to toss them in the chat, and I'll try to get to them. All right, I have some multiple windows open here. All right, so a little bit about me. Some of you may know me from my time at Gartner, where I spent the better part of the last decade and actually 12 years in total as a senior analyst with Gartner and Meta Group before that, researching and advising clients on data and analytics strategy. Not so much technologies from my end, but more about strategy. There was a time when I covered the ETL market and the data quality market, but I moved more into focusing on strategic items that are more of an interest to the senior leaders of data and analytics, which eventually became the Chief Data Officer. And in fact, at Gartner, in the last few years, I helped form and run the Gartner's Chief Data Officer Research and Advisory practice. So that was fun. But now, after publishing the book, I really wanted to advise clients more than just a half hour at a time or an hour at a time, which is kind of the mode at Gartner. And I really wanted to deep dive with clients and help them implement some of these concepts and ideas. So I was looking for the right kind of consulting situation. And I had known about West Monroe for a number of years. In fact, West Monroe was born from the ashes of Arthur Andersen. If you remember the Enron scandal, when it kind of shut things down for Arthur Andersen. A number of people there, like four people to be exact, decided they wanted to form another consultancy and kind of do it the right way and be very high-touch, socially conscious, white glove kind of consultancy. And I got to know them while I was at Gartner, actually advising West Monroe on its data and analytics practice. And one of the interesting things that West Monroe does, other than kind of do the traditional vertical and and horizontal technology consulting is we advise private equity firms on M&A deals. So we do what's called technology diligence, or the technology advisory part of that, where we go in and assess the technology stack of companies that are part of being considered by a private equity firm in terms of a merger and acquisition or a carve out or something like that. And so one of the things that I got to talking to Wes Monroe about was applying the valuation models that I've developed on how to quantify data's value. We'll talk about that and implement those as part of that process, because most private equity firms don't consider the value of data in valuing the deal overall. And in today's world, where we're in the midst of the information economy and the data age, that's a real tragic mistake and oversight, and we'll share some examples of that. So anyway, that's a little bit about Wes Monroe. 1,500 consultants based in Chicago, focused on certain verticals and horizontals throughout the North America. So here's a little bit about the book. The book is available in hardcover and audiobook and ebook as well. If you are interested, if you're a CDO yourself and interested in copies for yourself and your management team, definitely reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'll also post my email address here in the chat. Let me do that right now. And reach out to me. I have a kind of a cache of copies I can make available to executives. So just let me know. All right, so a lot of people want to know the genesis of Infonomics and how did this kind of all come to be. Unfortunately, it's the main genesis was I did work in the ETL space, with Prism Solutions. Some of you may know Bill Inman, who's known as the father of the data warehouse concept, and I worked for Prism Solutions, running the U.S. and then Asia Pacific consulting group. So I did, form an interest in the value of data as we're building data warehouses and the use cases behind that. But really, it all kind of came to a head for me when I was an analyst with my first go around with Gartner, actually with Metagroup, and it was during the 9/11 terror attacks. And after the terror attacks, some clients started contacting us, lamenting not only the tragic loss of life, but also ultimately the loss of their data. They realized that they had on-site backups and hadn't moved data into the cloud, and just it was before a lot of companies really had a cloud strategy, or some really didn't even have off-site backups, and if they did, they weren't particularly timely or up to date. So these companies actually lost their data, and they realized quickly that they didn't know who their customers were. They didn't have transaction records. They lost contract data. Some of them didn't even know who their employees were. So this became really an existential event for the companies, and not to be callous, but one of the company's executives told me, listen, we're heartbroken by the loss of life, but we can hire more employees, but we can't fabricate more data. We don't really. It's an existential event for our business, and so naturally, what do you do when you have a loss like that? Is you submit a claim to your insurer for the for the value of the loss. And so some companies in the Twin Towers submitted claims for the value of the data they lost, and the insurance companies said, well, sorry, we don't consider data to be property, therefore it's not covered by your property and casualty policies. And my mind was kind of blown by that. I said, well, I'd always thought about data as an asset or data as property. That's kind of weird. But I guess it was not really clear in those policies. And so what the insurance industry realized, it was a bit exposed. So what they did was they updated the commercial general liability policy standard that's used by most insurance companies to explicitly exclude electronic data from P&C policies. And when did they do that? They did that barely a month after 9/11. So, to add further insult to injury, I just realized I sent my email not to everyone, but to just the organizers. So here it comes. If you want copies of the book, there we go. So there were a number of court cases that ensued, and in fact, there have been a number of court cases around the world where organizations have claim that data has been lost and tried to value data. In fact, right now I'm working in, I just got conscripted by a law firm to provide expert testimony in a case where some dude stole his company's data and gave it to a competitor. It's actually a federal case, and so they asked me to come in and help value the data as part of the damages that they're asking for. So anyway, there are a number of court cases where data has been lost or stolen, and sometimes the courts have fallen on the side of data being property and said, well, listen, data can be represented by bubbles on an optical disc, or it can be printed, and therefore, it has physical properties, or can manifest in physical ways, and so it should be considered property. Other courts have issued ridiculous rulings like, well, since electrons have negligible mass, that's right, data shouldn't be considered property. And so that's kind of crazy world we live in right now. And then the accountants got on and said, hey, well, if the insurance industry is not going to recognize data as property and the courts are confused on the matter, then we can't recognize it as an asset. And so they updated the key financial standard, IAS or FAS 38, which deals with the recognition of intangible assets, to suggest that data can't be capitalized on balance sheets. So today, even if you wanted to include the value of your data on your balance sheet, you cannot do so, only under kind of rare circumstances. But even the digerati, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Nielsen, companies that sell data, can't value data on their balance sheet. In fact, the CEO of Nielsen, I spoke on a panel with him some years ago. He goes, well, of course the value of our data is on our balance sheet. I'm like, have you taken a look? You can't. It's not auditable if you do that. So anyway, and then the U.S. government got involved and said they had a hearing on how to evolve a 1930s style accounting system into the 21st century. That was actually the title of the hearing. And they invited a bunch of big 8 or big 6 consulting partners to testify. Now, why a 1930s style accounting system? Well, that's when the current kind of financial statements and asset classes were laid out by the then nascent SEC in the 1930s. And here we are 90 years later or so, and the asset classes haven't been updated since that time. So these guys testified and said, listen, because we can't formally recognize certain kinds of assets like data, it's creating undue market volatility and a lack of transparency for investors into companies. So right now, you have no idea what kind of data Facebook actually captures unless they decide to disclose it, but they're not required to do so according to accounting practices. So anyway, given that it was a U.S. Senate committee hearing, you can imagine what the outcome of that was. Right? Nothing. So that's where we are right now, where insurance companies don't recognize data as property, the courts are confused, and the accountants don't recognize data as an asset, and the U.S. government really not doing much about it other than implementing some kinds of privacy-related laws, but that's about it. So fast forward to today, and you can't go a day or a week without hearing somebody spout on about data being the new oil, pun intended. But I think that when I hear that, it certainly, I appreciate that somebody recognizes data has significant value. And in fact, there was a cover of The Economist magazine a few years ago that data is more valuable than oil, and that's kind of where this all got started. But it entirely misses the point that data has unique characteristics that go way beyond what oil has, and potentially maybe this is why it's more valuable. When you consume a drop of oil, it dissipates. It goes away. It creates heat, energy, and pollution. And so, but when you consume a unit of data, you can consume it. It doesn't deplete, right? You can consume it again and again. That's kind of the basis of models like Gartner, right? That sells the same research report over and over and over to people, or any kind of publishing industry. The other thing is that when you consume a drop of oil, you can only consume it one way at a time. This is very unlike data, where you can have multiple applications accessing the same data in the same database at the same time, more or less, and use it in multiple ways simultaneously. So that's unique. And then also, whenever you're consuming oil, it doesn't create more oil, right? But when you consume data, typically we're in a position to capture more data about whenever and wherever we're using that data. And so the top 3 items on this list on the right data is what economists would call a non-rivalrous, non-depleting, regenerative, or progenitive asset. And that is that it, again, can be used simultaneously, doesn't deplete, and can generate more data. So companies that are winning in the data economy today are ones that are taking advantage of those capabilities. You may call it digital transformation or whatever, but I think a lot of companies are doing this unconsciously. But I really think that data leaders like you all ought to be very conscious about taking full advantage of data's unique properties. And there's some other ones here as well. I won't get into. So then, I asked the question, isn't data an asset? Doesn't it meet the criteria of an asset? So I cracked open my accounting books from university, and I learned that an asset, no matter how you define it, whether it's a dictionary definition or a accounting definition, has the same kind of criteria, characteristics. An asset is something that is owned and or controlled, so it doesn't have to be owned, formally owned. It has to be something that at least you uniquely control. And then it's something that generates, is exchangeable for cash. So obviously we see data being exchanged for cash all the time now. And then it's something that generates probable future economic benefits. That's an update to accounting, to accounting regulations, or the definition. Probably in the late 1980s, I think they came up with that. And it used to be just something of value, but the accountants realized that an asset doesn't currently have to be delivering value to be considered an asset. And this has an important implication on data, because you often hear pundits run around saying, well, data only has value once you're using it. Well, that's entirely BS. I'm calling BS on that, because it's entirely inconsistent with the way that assets are valued by accountants. It can definitely have value if it's just sitting there in the database. It has potential future economic value, and that value can and should be measured, and we'll get into that in a bit. It's important for measuring kind of that gap between the actual value and the potential value of data. And then, I asked the question, are companies that are more serious about data becoming more data-centric, or as Tom Davenport calls it, data-driven, right? I think that's his original term, I'm not sure. But at least he's known for it. And we analyzed, while I was at Gartner, we analyzed hundreds of companies, and we looked at them and said, well, what kind of characteristics do companies have that when they're data-driven or data-centric? We said, well, they probably have an enterprise data governance function that demonstrates they're serious about controlling data and managing it like an actual asset. They probably have a data science organization that demonstrates that they're serious about generating value from their data, not just reporting on it. And they probably have a leader, an executive leader like a CDO, that demonstrates that they're serious at an executive level about the support and accountability and responsibility of data as a separate kind of asset. And so we looked for these kinds of companies, and lo and behold, we found that these kinds of companies that demonstrate these characteristics have a market to book value ratio that's nearly 2 times higher than the market average. And for you quants out there, we actually looked at a ratio called Tobin's Q, which is a market value to tangible asset replacement cost ratio. And for good measure, we took out of that equation data product companies, and we found that companies that are in the business of selling data or some kind of data derivative, that they have a market to book value that's nearly 3 times higher than the market average. This is not 3% or 30%. This is 300%. There is something that investors favor about companies that have data or are data driven. One interesting example in the news recently, and I wrote about this in Forbes, is that when due to COVID and the lack of inability to travel, the airlines started sucking wind, and so they needed to take out loans. And so what did they collateralize for those loans? Well, you would think that they would collateralize their planes, but no, planes are leased, so it's not really something that you can collateralize. What do they do? What they do have is all of the data within their customer loyalty programs. So United Airlines, American Airlines, and Delta, at least, and I think some others, ended up getting loans against the value of their customer loyalty programs, i.e. the data within them, to the tune of, catch this, 3 times, not 3 times, 10 times, 3 times the value of their company's of the market value of their companies. United Airlines, for example, got its customer loyalty program valued at nearly $30 billion against their own market cap of $9 billion. So clearly investors and savvy bankers are starting to recognize the value of data. And the idea behind Infonomics is really to help companies start doing this themselves as well, at least for internal purposes. So that gets us to Infonomics and the three main parts of Infonomics: monetizing, managing, and measuring data. Some of you may know me, Peter. I saw you post something earlier today or yesterday about the V's of or comment on the V's of big data. And so in kind of the aftermath and the lead up to Y2K, we realized companies started to get really digital, and e-commerce was taking off, and we realized that it wasn't just the volume of data that was an issue, but also the speed of data and the range of data sources. So that's when I first came up with the three V's of data: the volume, velocity, and variety. And I know others have added other V's that have nothing to do with bigness or magnitude, but seem to have lopped them onto the big data definition, for better or worse. So probably just to confuse people. But so anyway, now I'm kind of the three M's guy, and my goal is to become the three R's guy in a matter of years: retirement, relaxation, and I don't know, something else. So so let's cover these. So after 9/11, I started helping organizations measure the value of their data, some of the companies in the Twin Towers, and then I started thinking about data as an asset. And well, what do we do with assets? Well, we have to handle them, we have to administrate them or manage them in some way. And then we have to generate value from them or monetize them in some way. That's the kind of cycle, or the skinny version of the kind of the information supply chain, as John Ladley calls it. And so the way this all kind of fits together is, and I have this hypothesis that companies that don't measure, there's the old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so I thought, well, because companies don't measure the value of their data, they're not compelled to by accountants, and in many cases they don't even measure the value, the quality of their data, then they're in a poor position to manage it like an asset. If you're not measuring an asset, then you're not able to get the budget, the resources, the support for managing it as an actual asset. And conversely, any asset that you're not managing well is one that you're not going to be able to monetize well or generate value from. And you can see here that when I talk about monetizing data, what I mean is generating economic benefits from it, not necessarily selling it. That is one way to generate to monetize data, but there are a number of patterns that I've identified. I'll share with you. So for many companies, this tends to be a vicious cycle of not measuring their data. Therefore, they don't get the resources to manage it well. Therefore, they're not able to optimize the way that they're generating value from it. So the idea behind Infonomics is to reverse the curse, as we Cubs fans here in Chicago say, or flip the script. And that's kind of how it all fits together. But I want to start with the end in mind. So let's first zero in on monetizing data. Again, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat here. If anybody has any questions or comments, happy to address them. All right, let's open that. Make sure I'm opening up the chat. I can see it. There we go. Okay, on to monetizing data as an asset. So one of the things I've done over the years is I've captured, and Peter alluded to this, hundreds of examples, about 5 or 6, maybe 700 examples of how organizations are using data and analytics in innovative and high value ways, i.e. monetizing their data, not just reporting on it, but actually generating real value from it. And when I stepped back and started looking at these examples, it occurred to me that they fall into certain kinds of patterns. So let's take a look at those. And they fall into patterns where data is used more internally, what I call indirect data monetization, because you're not really generating cash for it or any kind of goods or services, but you're using it indirectly to generate value for the business. And this can take the form of improving the performance of sales or operations or other processes. It can take the form of reducing risk or improving compliance, and that can have some measurable value. It can lead to introducing understanding market opportunities for new products or services, or new business models altogether. It can help you kind of grease the skids with partners and suppliers. to improve those relationships or build them. We see companies exchanging data with partners just to attract them and retain them. And then I'm going to skip the branded indices for a second. Let's talk about the direct data monetization. So often we see companies bartering or trading with data, not just selling it for cash, but exchanging it in return for goods and services or favorable commercial terms like delivery terms or payment terms, something like that. And why do I put bartering and trading first? Well, it really is a primary way that organizations are monetizing their data. And why don't they just sell it for cash? Well, the answer to that may be obvious to you, which is that anything that you sell for cash becomes a transaction on your income statement, i.e. it is taxable. But if you're bartering with data, which is ostensibly a zero value asset according to accountants, you don't really, and I'm not here to give tax advice, but you don't have to record it as a transaction. Case in point, discounts. You go into the grocery store, you scan your loyalty card when you're checking out, and you get a discount on your food. But we know what's really happening, and that is you're getting free food in return for what? Information about you and your purchase. So it's a barter transaction, effectively, kind of a predefined one. But this kind of thing is happening more and more in the B2B world, and companies that are really forward-looking find ways to exchange data with partners or suppliers in return for either goods and services or discounts or other types of benefits. Obviously, we can enhance our existing products or services with data. So think about any product or service that you offer today, and you can bake data into it or data derivative like analytics into it to make it that much more valuable and that much more competitive in the market. Or you can digitalize it altogether. A cool example of this is like Intuit, the TurboTax preparation software we use here in the U.S. And they not only have monetized the entire 74,000 page tax code of the U.S., but they also include all sorts of analytics as you're going along and doing your taxes to make it that much more, again, competitive and compelling for customers. Obviously, you can sell data yourself, or you can sell your raw data through data brokers or through data marketplaces, or again, sell data derivatives, reports, or analytics. Or increasingly, banks are selling synthetic data, which is detailed data that has been dithered so that it doesn't actually represent real people or real transactions, but at a detailed level retains the same kind of statistical characteristics. So it can be used in similar ways other than targeting individuals. And so one of the things that also comes up on the bottom there is companies have come to me, and I didn't write about this in the book because this really kind of came to light more as GDPR took hold, where clients have said, listen, we can't monetize our customer data. Again, I kind of call BS on that because you're just not being creative enough. Listen, I understand you can't sell your data, your customer data, to other people, but that doesn't mean you can't sell other people's or other companies' products or services to your customers, and that's what I call inverted data monetization. So, for example, I'm working with a hospital who says, yeah, due to HIPAA regulations, we can't sell our patient data, but there are companies out there that want access to it. I said, well, why don't you flip that script and say, listen, we know who our diabetes patients are. We can't sell you that data, but we can sell your healthy meal plans or gym memberships or at-home glucose monitoring, test kits to our diabetes patients without ever having to expose who they are to you, and then take a cut of that action, take a referral fee or a commission, and that's what we call inverted data monetization. So if you're out there, and you're legal eagles or somebody says, yeah, we can't monetize our customer data, it's just not true. You're just not thinking about it creatively enough. I want to go back to publishing branded indices for a second. If you're making data available externally, in any of these forms, bartering it, selling it directly, or any form, it's a great idea to advertise that you've got data available for sale or for licensing by creating and publishing a branded index. A great example of this is ADP, the payroll processing company that sells, obviously they collect a lot of data on payroll and employment, and they publish an employment number on a, I don't know if it's a weekly or monthly or quarterly basis. It's known to be more accurate and more timely than even the US government's own numbers. They don't publish it just to poke a finger in the eye of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They publish it to advertise that they've got additional data for sale, and they make millions of dollars selling all this data that they collect through the various workforce management applications and payroll processing applications. Again, without ever exposing an individual customer. So how do we monetize our data? I want to just kind of jump in and share our overall approach to data monetization. And one of the things you'll notice, and listen, I'm the first one to say there's not a lot new about Infonomics. It's about applying traditional, classic methodologies for the way that we monetize and measure and manage other kinds of assets. And so what you'll see here is pretty much a way is a standard new product introduction methodology that involves generating and refining ideas for innovating with available data assets. And I say available data assets because you can look externally at valuable data as well. We've identified 7 kinds of key data sources, data internally, dark data that you're kind of forgotten about or archived, open data sets, harvested web content, data that you get from partners or suppliers, data you can harvest from social media, and then there's syndicated data from data providers. So there's all this external data that can be monetized as well in different ways. And so when we run these workshops, these ideation workshops, we explore not only these external data sources and the possibility of integrating them with your own, but we also explore the extended business ecosystem, not just your own stakeholders and your immediate suppliers and partners, but who are your suppliers' partners and your partners' suppliers and your suppliers' suppliers and your partners' partners and your partners' customers. We look at that extended business ecosystem for opportunities to market and create data products for those stakeholders. Then what we do is we go into a process of prioritizing them on a spectrum of feasibility characteristics. We look at things like, are they economically feasible? Is the idea practical, marketable, operationally feasible, technically feasible? Is the data in good enough quality? Is it ethical? Is it legal? And so we go through a disciplined approach of testing the ideas that way. Then we'll go out and market them with actual potential buyers. Think about how to package these data products and license them. Are we going to create raw material? Are we going to create derivative data products? Are we going to allow filtering? Are we going to publish it? Or are we going to have buyers come to our website to access the data on our platform rather than letting it out in the wild? Then you go through the whole process of identifying and curating and preparing the data, the technical environments, and setting all that up. So again, very much just like any other kind of new product introduction process, but more specific to data. Obviously, analytics plays a big part in monetizing data. As I mentioned, I've looked at these hundreds of use cases that I've developed, and almost none of them have anything to do with a hindsight-oriented analytics. Building pretty pie charts or bouncy bar charts, what we call descriptive analytics, which answers the question, what happened? What did we sell last quarter? Who cares? That's interesting for maybe paying commissions or bonuses or financial statements, but that's not actionable. So at Gartner, we developed this analytic kind of continuum where we identify different styles of analytics: diagnostic and predictive and prescriptive analytics, and each one is a higher value proposition. But yet, unfortunately, there's a lot of inertia pushing down on organizations continuing to build scorecards and dashboards and boring stuff like that. And yes, it gets harder. The skills get more difficult to attain and more expensive, and the technologies become more sophisticated. But we really think that there's an imperative to move up this continuum when it comes to monetizing your data or doing any form of analytics. Now, I want to share just a few examples here of companies that are monetizing data. These are some of my all-time favorites that I like to talk about. Some of them are in the book. Walmart Labs realized that they had a great search engine, but that helped people find what they were looking for online. But one week they realized that there was a high degree of shopping cart abandonment for a certain search term. That search term was the word house. And what they realized was people were searching not for housing goods or housewares or dog houses, but it happened to coincide with the week that a certain television show premiered, and you can imagine what that is. It's the TV show House, the medical drama. And so what people were looking for was the box DVD set, or the ability to stream previous seasons. So Walmart realized that their search engine wasn't taking into account external data, what was trending in the world. It was just staring at its own navel, basically. And when they updated that search engine, they ended up reducing shopping cart abandonment by 10 to 15%. Infinity Insurance is a small insurer in the southeastern U.S. They realized that they were sitting on a gold mine of adjuster reports that, where an investor goes out and investigates a claim, and they realized through text mining they could identify the kinds of language and phrases and omissions that were indicative of fraud. They ended up reducing fraud by like 88% or something, and then baking those models into their claims processing engine. Lockheed Martin heard me speak on dark data, again, that's unutilized data, one time, and somebody in the audience asked the question, what dark data do we have? And I said, well, you're probably sitting on 20 years of archived emails. He was the CIO of a big four consultancy. And he said, yeah, so what? I said, well, you're in the business of running successful projects. And have you ever analyzed the project communications on those projects to identify leading indicators of project issues like scope, budget, personnel, technology, whatever? Or are you just waiting for somebody to issue a status report and then deal with it more in kind of a hindsight-oriented manner? And so Lockheed Martin went and took this idea. They're analyzing all sorts of project documentation on projects, and they now have what they claim 3 times greater foresight into project issues, and are saving hundreds of millions of dollars a year in cost overruns now that they're getting this kind of foresight-oriented status. Dollar General is a classic example of a company that's selling its data, for cash. They sell their shopping basket analysis and inventory and pricing data, and they make it available to their CPG suppliers. And I think the most interesting part of this story is they have a self-funding data warehouse or data lake now, and I think it's certainly a goal, an objective, and probably shame on your organization if you don't have a self-funding data warehouse today. There's really no excuse not to do that. The other thing that I'll mention is that it's hard for a lot of companies because they're already giving away data. Where do you draw that line in the sand and start creating premium analytic or data product offerings that you're not giving them away anymore? You're actually generating some value from them. Allstate came to me and said, the chief data scientist said, listen, the automobile companies want to buy our claims data, and we can't sell it to them. Obviously it would be a win-win-win for everybody. Better made cars, cheaper insurance rates, etc. But we're the good hands company, right? That's their motto. We can't be seen as selling our data. So I said, well, this doesn't sound like it's a technology problem or a data problem. It's a brand problem. So why don't you take this idea off brand and maybe form a separate business or a joint venture to do this? And that's exactly what they did. Within 7 months, they had formed a company called Arity, Arity, which is now a platform for any insurance company to monetize its data. I would skip Minute Maid, and the last one's kind of fun. In Iceland, they have this really interesting problem where everybody's related to everybody else, which makes for really fun family reunions, but it's difficult to find a mate who's not your cousin. Apparently it's a real problem. And so some enterprising young app developers built an app for that. So the tagline for the app, this is their tagline, you can now bump your phones before you bump in bed. So anyway, all sorts of clever ways to leverage data. And the data that they use for that, they baked in the Icelandic genealogy database, basically their ancestry.com data to do this. So I want to share a couple of, I'm going to skip these because I'm going to share them next time. I'm going to share the CDO findings on our next talk. So jump ahead. Let's talk about data as an asset. So I often, and I know Peter does this as well, advise companies on their data strategies. And very often when we're looking at these data strategy documents, they say up front, data is our most critical asset. We want to manage our data as an asset. And then I'm reviewing the data strategy document for this one company, an energy company, and I see that they don't have anything in their document about inventorying their data, cataloging their data. I said, how are you going to manage anything like an asset if you don't know what you have? And they said, well, yeah, well, maybe, but we're an energy company. We really only maintain an inventory of our trucks and our transformers and our generators. And so I said, well, that's great, but why don't you apply that same kind of discipline to your data assets? And so they nodded gratuitously. Anyway, after the meeting, I went into the men's room, and this is what I see. They've inventory tagged their urinals and their sinks and their toilets. Not to be obscene or anything, but I think it's obscene that a company will inventory things that are just not driving business value as much as their data. And so I kind of pointed this out to them. So where do we go for inspiration or sources of asset management inspiration? Yeah, there are a number of methodologies that have been posited by various consulting firms, but if we really want to measure manage data as an actual asset, why don't we borrow from the way that other assets are managed? And there's a couple of reasons to do this. One, shoot, they're already defined, well-described, well-defined, well-honed asset management principles and practices and methodologies and standards. But two, if we use them, we're able to speak the language of our businesses. And this is a key point in data literacy or data fluency. If we're a physical asset management company like a retailer or a manufacturer, why aren't we using PAS 55 to manage our data, right? And that way, we're able to communicate with business people in the same way that they communicate about the core business assets. If we're a financial management company, bank, or maybe an insurer, why aren't we using financial asset management approaches? If we're a high-tech company, why aren't we using ITIL to manage our data assets? If we're a services company, why aren't we using human capital management practices and principles and language to manage our data assets? So I would encourage you as chief data officers to become familiar with the asset management methodologies within your kind of sector, and think about how you might kind of infuse your own data management practices with some of these principles and practices, and even the language itself. One example of that, and one of the things I did was generate these generally accepted information principles, kind of based on my tour of all of these methodologies, and kind of what are some commonalities. So one of them here is we'll call it the ownership principle. And the ownership principle states that data is not something that should be owned by any individual or department within an organization. It should be an enterprise asset. And furthermore, that term ownership that we often ascribe to people who have ultimate responsibility for a data asset within our enterprise data governance functions, it is a really terrible idea. It's the concept of owner, or the term owner, is something that perpetuates hoarding and silos and just all sorts of bad behaviors. And so when I looked at other asset management principles and practices, I came across the concept of a trustee. And so I think something that we recommend to our clients is using the term trustee or fiduciary to talk about ownership. And that term holds certain kinds of ethical and legal responsibilities with it as well. So anyway, in the book, I go into details on these generally accepted information principles, so you can kind of check them out. Let's skip this and go into measuring information as an asset. And so we can measure any kind of asset in a variety of ways. We can measure its actual value or realized value. We can measure its probable economic value, remember, as accountants do, or we can look at its potential value. If we use this data asset in any and all ways that we can possibly conceive, what is that art of the possible for that asset? And so there are different ways that we can measure this performance gap or the vision gap to help kind of close them and enable our organization to do more with data. So to that end, I developed a set of data valuation models, and I did this in collaboration with some economists and accountants and clients and valuation experts. And so we came up with a set of kind of 6 basic models. I'll start over on the left. And the foundational models are really for those organizations that really aren't quite ready yet, or maybe not interested in financially valuing their data. But they should at least measure its quality characteristics and its scarcity to determine what is its intrinsic value. data that's more correct, more complete, and more scarce, i.e. more ubiquitous, less ubiquitous to the industry, has greater potential value for our organization. And so maybe that's data we should be focusing more on managing better or leveraging better. The business value model says, how not only what are the quality characteristics of this data, but how specific, how relevant is it to particular business processes? And that gives us an idea of maybe if the data is underutilized or being utilized well compared to other data assets. And I'll show you how some companies are using these models. And then the one on the bottom left says, how does having this data actually drive business process performance, maybe in ways that are non-financial, like is it reducing if we use this data better, could we reduce our sales cycle times or increase the margins on our deals or something like that, or attract more partners? Over on the right, all I've done is really borrow from the way that that accountants and valuation experts value any kind of asset using the cost approach, the market approach, and the income approach. The challenge is that because data is this non-rivalrous, non-depleting asset, we needed to adjust some of these models a bit to accommodate for that, because data is something that you can sell over and over again. So how do you determine the market value? So there's a bit of an optimization challenge to applying that. And then the economic value model says, how does this data actually contribute to top or bottom line numbers or expense savings? And then what we do is we subtract out the cost to acquire or generate, apply, and administer the data, just to kind of get to a net value. I'm not going to go into detail. Here are the models. They're detailed in the book, along with how to adapt them to certain kinds of scenarios and kind of what all the terminologies mean. But you can see that they're pretty approachable. They're not terribly complex. Okay. Well, last thing I want to show here really is how organizations are using these models. In the upper left here, there's companies like Boeing that came to us and they said, listen, we've got data that is, we've got so much data, we can't manage it all equally. How do we prioritize? And so we said, well, let's find data that has a low IVI, basically a low intrinsic value, a low quality index, but a high business relevancy. That's data that you should probably be focusing on managing better. The next one is from AIG, whose chief data officer, who I worked with at Deloitte, Leandro Dalamule, showed me how he took the models and identified, basically connected the dots between the quality of data and how it drives business process performance. So he can actually track, I think he's moved on, but he could track how a 1% increase in data accuracy or a 3% increase in data completeness actually affected the business processes where that data is being used. In the bottom left is a story from an energy company, a manufacturing company called Vivint. They make security systems, and they were challenged by their parent company to better use the data that they already have, not change the business model, not transform the business, but you guys have all this data that you're not using very well. And they acknowledged that, and they said, okay, let's sort that out. So they identified data that was dry, that wasn't generating a lot of economic value for them, but had a high business relevancy. And they said at the intersection of that is data that we should be doing more with. And so they identified 24 different ways to better leverage data, like using customer support data in the manufacturing context and vice versa. And they ended up, when all was said and done, they ended up adding, I think they said $300 million on a $2 billion business. So really, really great example there. In the upper right, where companies come to us and they say, what data should we monetize? The simple answer to that is, well, you should monetize data that has a low cost basis, a high quality index, and a high business relevancy, not only to yourselves, but perhaps to others. And then I'm just going to skip to the bottom right. An energy company, MISO Energy in Indiana, showed us how they identified data that was costing them more to manage and store and secure and so forth than the economic value it was generating. And because they are in a regulated industry, they really couldn't monetize it in any really kind of new and innovative ways. So they said, hey, let's make a defensible disposal or defensible deletion decision to get rid of this data. And they're now saving millions of dollars a year in unnecessary infrastructure costs and the cloud environment and so forth. So the last thing I'll say is and I'm not going to go into detail, but we looked at, this is kind of the nomics part of Infonomics. When you look at traditional economic models like supply and demand and marginal utility and so forth, they were all designed with traditional goods and services in mind. And nobody's ever really thought about how do they apply in the context of information. You know, is there really an unlimited supply of data, and how do we attenuate demand for it? How do we determine pricing when data is infinitely copyable? For marginal utility, do we really need to be concerned about the marginal utility of continually publishing the same data to individuals? Well, yes, maybe, but increasingly the primary consumers of data are machines, not humans. So does marginal utility really hold? And so on and so forth. So there's an entire chapter in the book about some thinking about these applied economic concepts and what both the producers and consumers of data can learn and take advantage of. And so I encourage you to kind of check that out. I also, again, teach an MBA class, as Peter mentioned, at the University of Illinois Geese School of Business. The materials are also available on Coursera. If you want to take the course on Coursera, I know a lot of CDOs have already taken it. I think about 10,000 people have taken the courses already. We just introduced a data monetization capstone for it, so that's really cool. So if you're not taking an MBA at Illinois, you can still take the courses on Coursera. Maybe I'll punch a link to it in the chat here. But I just want to wrap up and just address a couple of questions. So my recommendations pretty simply are, monetize not only your data, but others' data, and do so in a variety of ways. Don't get fixated on one way to do it. Manage your data with the same kind of discipline as your other assets. Apply asset management practices and principles from your industry to the way that you're managing and handling data, and introduce those over time. And then definitely measure and improve your data's potential and its realized value to drive certain kinds of behaviors in your organization. Maybe even just to improve data literacy. And then you'll consider that data works a little bit differently in the context of key economic principles, and learn a little bit about that, think on it, and think how you might apply them in your organization. So that's about it. Oh, here's some links. Here's how to reach me, and a little bit about the Coursera course and so forth. So I do see a question here in the chat, Robert. I think you
Yep, I posted the code. Yeah, there's 2 questions in the chat there.
Monetize data collected from customers or other purposes. Data ownership. Do you have views on this matter? Yeah. So I think I mentioned. I think I addressed data ownership. Here's the challenge. Again, because data ownership is not something that the courts really support. Yes, there are regulations now like the CCPA and GDPR, which introduce mandate, and HIPAA, which introduce mandates within an industry for handling customer data. Okay, and there are fines associated with them. There are no real general laws about data ownership. So instead of focusing on who owns the data, which is really kind of not meaningful, focus on rights and privileges and responsibilities. I work with companies, and we go in and we analyze the contracts that they have with their customers or partners, in which data is exchanged as part of that deal. And very often they forget about all sorts of things like survivorship terms. Like if we sever the contract, does the buyer or licensee of the data get to continue to use the data? So there's a lot to be concerned about, but forget about ownership. Ownership is meaningless in the context of data. It's all about rights and privileges and responsibilities. So that's my general guidance on that. And I think my former colleague, who's a lawyer at Gartner, Lydia Clarity Jones, would agree. Focus on those 3 things, not ownership. Another question here: data created and managed and data value chain context. How about having context the metadata? Yeah, so you can definitely apply these same models to valuing metadata. Metadata is a bit more derivative than say transactional data or customer data. But yeah, metadata has certain value in helping do things like impact analysis and helping people find and trust data. So it definitely has an impact on the way that data is utilized, and it's not impossible to connect the dots. There's been some challenges in recent years as to what actually constitutes metadata versus data, and that has found its way into the courts, particularly a real popular court case with a telecommunications company in Australia. I think I wrote about in the book. And so, yeah, what is metadata and what's that fine line between metadata and data is something that is still being sorted out. Applicability for federal administration besides reducing costs. So there obviously some federal agencies do have kind of a revenue, mandate to generate revenue, to bring in income, but very often they're more concerned with with their constituents like citizens or businesses or the environment or things like that. And so there are other things to measure. You can plug in other measures other than dollars in these valuation formulas. I'm happy to talk to you, Mark, a little bit more about that. But yeah, I've worked with New South Wales and Australia, the EPA, and others to apply these models for their own value drivers. Okay. Tricia, yeah, raw data is rarely interesting. So my kind of take on that is raw data has, if you're thinking about creating data products, raw data has greater general applicability than derivative data, but derivative data has more specific applicability. So there's often a trade-off between, yeah, how much do we prepare data, filter it, or create some derivative product of it if we're going to market it to a smaller market. So yeah, I generally would agree with you that raw data often has to be kind of processed into some kind of form where it's more usable. Some people call that turning data into information. I don't really like to discriminate data versus information because it's just one of the ways that we as data people continue to confuse our business people brethren. So anyway, that's about it. Peter, if you want to take it away and kind of wrap up, I really appreciate everyone joining us today and all the questions, and feel free to reach out to me if you want to continue to engage. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Doug, thank you so much for a great talk. It gets better every time I hear it, and I know you've done this enough times that you could do it in your sleep, but the word is still got to get out there, and so we really appreciate everybody joining you on this particular call, and look forward to it. Again, as I said, this is part 1 of 2. You're going to be back with us on May 6th at exactly the same time, and maybe you could give us just a little preview about what's coming up, and then also what your new book is going to be on.
Yeah. Oh, so the new book is going to be on those hundreds of use cases and examples. And I'm going to share 100 of my favorite ones, but I was going to provide an analysis on each of them, but then I realized, well, that's kind of boring, just my own analysis. I know a lot of people who are brilliant people in the industry, like Peter and others. And so I kind of conscripted all of them to write up a brief commentary on each of these stories. So it's going to be 100 stories on how to monetize data, real-world stories, accompanied by an analysis and recommendations from 100 experts around the world. So it's going to be really different, very, very exciting.
We're very much looking forward to that. And then the business case for the chief data officer too. We've seen a lot of studies where people will say, oh, okay, well, if you have a CDO, therefore they can value the company more. And that's very different from the kind of analysis that you did in terms of the way company value was actually calculated. So I think we do need this next case in here, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing this as well. Yeah. Well, I'm going to share some hard data. We surveyed 500 plus companies now, and on how having a chief data officer has affected their organization, and it's really, really groundbreaking stuff. I'm so looking forward to it. Doug, thank you so much for taking time to do this today, and we'll look forward to seeing you in just a couple of weeks. So hopefully everybody can join us back. Take care. Cheers. Thank you, Doug.